Prince Alexander stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his modest apartment in Vancouver, watching the morning rain streak down the glass. The phone in his hand felt heavier than it should have, displaying the missed calls from numbers he recognized but hadn't answered in 3 years. 27 missed calls, 14 voicemails, and a text message that made his chest tighten with each word he read again. Uncle Edward passed peacefully this morning. Funeral arrangements being made. The family hopes you will consider returning. Mother. The words blurred slightly as Alexander set the phone on the windowsill and ran both hands through his dark hair. Uncle Edward, the Duke of Westmarch, had been more than just his father's younger brother. He had been the one who taught Alexander to fish in the palace streams, who listened without judgment when teenage rebellion turned into very adult consequences, and who had quietly supported his decision to leave the royal life behind when the rest of the family saw it as betrayal. 3 years. 3 years since he had walked away from the crown prince title, from the expectations, from the endless protocols that felt like chains around his ankles. 3 years since the explosive interview where he had spoken too honestly about the pressures of royal life, about feeling trapped in a role he never chose, about wanting something real instead of the carefully orchestrated performances that pass for a royal existence. The backlash had been swift and brutal. The tabloids called him ungrateful, spoiled, a disgrace to the crown. His father, King William, had barely spoken to him in those final weeks before Alexander's departure. His younger sister, Princess Charlotte, had cried and begged him to stay. His mother, Queen Catherine, had stood in stony silence as he packed his belongings into 2 simple suitcases, leaving behind centuries of accumulated wealth and privilege for an uncertain future in a country where his title meant nothing. Alexander moved away from the window and walked through his small but comfortable apartment. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where he had learned to cook for himself, a living room filled with books he had chosen rather than inherited, and photographs of the life he had built here. Pictures of him working at the local wildlife conservation center, volunteering at the homeless shelter, learning to fix his own car, making friends who knew him as Alex, not Prince Alexander. The apartment was a world away from Kensington Palace, where he had grown up surrounded by staff who anticipated his every need, where his daily schedule was planned months in advance, where every public appearance was rehearsed and every word was measured for its potential impact on the monarchy's reputation. Here, his biggest decision on most days was whether to have coffee or tea with breakfast. He had found work as a project coordinator for an environmental nonprofit organization, using his education in international relations and his natural ability to connect with people. His colleagues knew about his royal background, of course, but they treated him as just another member of the team. It was the first time in his life he had been valued for what he contributed rather than what he represented. The phone buzzed again, and this time Alexander picked it up immediately. Charlotte's name appeared on the screen, along with a photograph of his 24-year-old sister making a silly face during their last Christmas together, for years ago now. Alex. Her voice was thick with tears, and just the sound of her saying his childhood nickname made his throat tighten. I got the message, he said quietly, sinking into the armchair that had become his favorite reading spot. He asked for you, you know, in the last few weeks when the cancer got worse. He kept asking if we had heard from you, if you were happy, if you might come home for Christmas this year. Charlotte's words came out in a rush, as if she was afraid he would hang up before she could say everything she needed to say. Alexander closed his eyes. Uncle Edward had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months ago, but the family had kept the news private. Alexander only learned about it through a carefully worded email from his former private secretary, who still felt some loyalty to the prince who had always treated him with respect rather than as invisible help. Charlotte, I know it's complicated, she interrupted. I know Father was harsh when you left. I know the press will go crazy if you come back. But, Alex, he was your family too. He never stopped loving you, even when everyone else was angry about the interview and the book deal and all of it. The book. Alexander felt his stomach clench at the mention of it. 6 months after leaving Britain, when his savings were running low and the small job he had found was barely covering his expenses, a publisher had approached him about writing his memoirs. The advance was enough to secure his future, and he had convinced himself that telling his story honestly might help other young people who felt trapped by family expectations. The book, titled Crown of Thorns, A Prince's Journey to Freedom, had become an international bestseller. But it had also reopened every wound within the royal family. Alexander had written about the loneliness of royal life, about watching his parents' marriage strain under public pressure, about the anxiety attacks that started when he was 16, and that palace doctors had quietly treated with medication and silence. He had written about feeling like a performing seal, trained to smile and wave and say the right things while dying slowly inside. The royal family's response had been swift and coordinated. A statement expressing disappointment in Alexander's decision to profit from private family matters, the removal of his remaining royal patronages, and, most painfully, the decision to strip him of his military honors, including his cherished rank as captain in the parachute regiment, earned through genuine service rather than ceremony. "Is he really gone, Charlotte?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. This morning, just after sunrise. He was at Westmarch Castle in the Rose Garden. You remember how he always said he wanted to die in that garden, surrounded by the flowers he planted with Aunt Margaret? Alexander did remember. Uncle Edward had never remarried after his wife died in a car accident 15 years ago. Instead, he had poured his love into his gardens, his charities for military veterans, and his role as the family's unofficial peacemaker. When Alexander and his father fought, it was Uncle Edward who would quietly suggest compromise. When the media became too intrusive, it was Uncle Edward who would invite the younger royals to his estate for private weekends away from photographers and protocols. "The funeral is in a week," Charlotte continued. "Friday morning at Westminster Cathedral, followed by a private burial at Westmarch. Alex, I know you don't owe us anything, and I know Father made everything worse when you left. But Uncle Edward would have wanted you there. And honestly, I need you there." The vulnerability in his sister's voice broke something loose in Alexander's chest. Charlotte had always been the strong one, the one who embraced royal duty while somehow maintaining her sense of humor and genuine warmth. If she was admitting she needed him, things must be worse than he understood. "Tell me about the last 3 years," he said instead of answering directly. "How are you? How are Mother and Father?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment, and Alexander could hear her moving around, probably finding somewhere private to continue this conversation. "It's been hard, Alex. The monarchy is under more scrutiny than ever. There are constant questions about relevance, about cost to taxpayers, about whether the institution should even continue into the next generation. Your book didn't help, but honestly, the problems were already there." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller. "Father has aged 10 years in the last 3. I think losing you broke something in him, even though he'll never admit it. He buries himself in state business, official duties, anything to avoid thinking about it. Mother tries to keep everything normal, but she's exhausted, and I feel like I'm trying to hold the whole thing together while pretending everything is fine." Alexander felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on his shoulders. He had told himself that leaving was about his own mental health, his own right to choose his life. But he had known that his departure would shift additional burden onto Charlotte's shoulders. She had never complained, never made him feel guilty, but he had known. "And your personal life?" he asked. "Are you happy?" Charlotte laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Happy? Alex, I haven't had a real relationship since you left. Every man I meet either wants to date a princess for the status or runs away when he realizes what royal life actually means. I spend most of my time opening hospitals and attending state dinners and smiling for photographs while feeling completely alone." The pain in her voice made Alexander stand up and pace to the window again. Outside, Vancouver continued its ordinary day. People walked dogs, joggers passed by, delivery trucks made their rounds. Normal life, the kind he had craved his entire childhood, continued while his sister described a loneliness that felt all too familiar. "What about friends?" he asked. "Real friends? The kind who like you for yourself rather than what you can do for them? You were my best friend, Alex. When you left, you took that with you too." The accusation was gentle, but it hit like a physical blow. Alexander had thought about Charlotte constantly during his first year in Canada, had written dozens of emails he never sent, had picked up the phone to call her hundreds of times. But each time he had stopped himself. He had told himself that staying away was kinder, that would allow the family to move forward without the constant reminder of his defection. Now he realized that his silence had been selfish, that his sister had needed him even if the institution they had grown up in had taught them both to hide their emotional needs behind public duty. "I've thought about you every day," he said quietly. "I wanted to call, wanted to write, wanted to, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if you hated me for leaving." "Hate you?" Charlotte's voice cracked. "Alex, I was angry for about 6 months. Angry that you left me to deal with everything alone. But hate you? You're my brother. You're the person who taught me to climb trees and sneak extra dessert and question everything, even when questioning things wasn't royal behavior. How could I hate you for finally having the courage to live authentically?" Alexander felt tears building behind his eyes. 3 years of carefully constructed independence suddenly felt fragile, built on a foundation of unresolved pain and family connections that geography couldn't break. "If I come back," he said slowly, "it will be a circus. The press will follow every step. They'll want to know if I'm returning permanently, if I'm reconciling with father, if I regret leaving. Every newspaper will have analysis of what my presence means for the future of the monarchy." "I know," Charlotte said. "But, Alex, if you don't come back, you'll regret it forever." And Uncle Edward, he believed in second chances, in forgiveness, in family above everything else. He would have wanted you there, and he would have wanted us to figure out how to be a family again. Alexander looked around his Canadian apartment, at the life he had built from nothing, at the independence he had fought so hard to achieve. Then he thought about his uncle, who had never judged him, who had quietly sent birthday cards even after the rest of the family had cut contact, who had somehow managed to love unconditionally in a world where love often came with conditions and expectations. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "I need to figure out the logistics, talk to my boss about time off, decide what this means for my life here." "Of course," Charlotte said quickly. "I understand. But Alex, whatever you decide about everything else, about father and the family and the future, Uncle Edward is gone. This isn't about politics or the monarchy or public relations. It's about saying goodbye to someone who loved you." After they hung up, Alexander sat in the growing darkness of his apartment without turning on the lights. The rain had stopped, and through the window he could see the lights of the city beginning to twinkle. Vancouver had become home in a way that surprised him. Not just because it offered anonymity and freedom, but because he had discovered who he was when stripped of titles and expectations. He had learned that he was good at making genuine connections with people, that he found satisfaction in work that felt meaningful, that he could be happy with less if that less was truly his own choice. But family, he was learning, was more complicated than geography or good intentions could resolve. Uncle Edward was gone, and no amount of principled independence would bring him back or erase the regret of 3 years of silence. Alexander picked up his phone and scrolled through the contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in 2 years. His former private secretary, James, had helped facilitate the quiet communication about Uncle Edward's illness and had always been someone who understood the complicated balance between personal needs and royal obligations. "James? It's Alexander. Yes, I know it's been a while. I need to ask you about something. Hypothetically, if I were to return to Britain for Uncle Edward's funeral, what would that look like? What kind of security arrangements, what kind of media management, what kind of protection could be arranged?" The conversation that followed was practical and detailed, covering everything from travel arrangements to security protocols to the complex question of how a prince in exile could return home without either seeming to abandon his principles or becoming a circus sideshow. By the time Alexander hung up, it was nearly midnight. He made himself a simple dinner and sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists. Practical considerations, flights, accommodation, time off work, what to wear to a royal funeral when you were no longer officially royal. Emotional considerations, seeing his parents for the first time in 3 years, facing the British media again, returning to a world he had publicly rejected. And then, at the bottom of the second page, he wrote the question that really mattered. What would Uncle Edward want me to do? The answer came immediately, in his uncle's patient voice explaining that sometimes doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing, that family forgiveness was a choice rather than a feeling, and that love required showing up even when showing up was complicated. Alexander looked out at the Vancouver skyline one more time, then picked up his phone to book a flight to London. The first-class cabin of the British Airways flight from Vancouver to London felt both familiar and foreign to Alexander as he settled into his seat. 3 years ago, he would have traveled on the royal flight, surrounded by security personnel and staff members whose job was to ensure his comfort and safety. Now, he was just another passenger, albeit one traveling under an assumed name that James had arranged through careful diplomatic channels. The flight attendant who offered him champagne had no idea she was serving a prince, and Alexander found both relief and strange melancholy in her ordinary politeness. He had grown to love anonymity during his time in Canada, but returning to his homeland made him acutely aware of how much he had lost along with the burden of royal expectations. 6 hours into the 8-hour flight, Alexander finally opened the folder James had prepared for him. Inside were carefully selected newspaper clippings from the past 3 years, showing him how the royal family had been portrayed in his absence. The headlines told a story of increasing pressure on the monarchy, declining public approval ratings, and constant speculation about the institution's future. King William faces modernization pressure as younger generation questions royal relevance. Princess Charlotte takes on increased duties as family adapts to Prince Alexander's absence. Royal finances under scrutiny. Are taxpayers getting value from the crown? But it was the more recent headlines that made Alexander's stomach tighten. Beloved Duke of Westmarch's final months. A life of service remembered. Will Prince Alexander return for Uncle's funeral? Palace remains silent. Royal family sources. We hope for reconciliation during this difficult time. Alexander closed the folder and leaned back in his seat. The media attention was already beginning, exactly as he had predicted. By now, his booking on this flight would have been discovered by reporters who made it their business to track royal movements. There would probably be photographers waiting at Heathrow, and certainly a crowd of journalists at whatever hotel or residence he chose for his stay. James had offered to arrange accommodation at one of the royal residences, but Alexander had declined. Staying at Kensington Palace or Windsor Castle would send signals about reconciliation and future plans that he wasn't ready to send. Instead, he had booked a suite at a discreet hotel in Marylebone, one that catered to wealthy international guests and had experience managing privacy for high-profile visitors. The passenger seated next to him, a businesswoman in her 50s who had been working on her laptop throughout the flight, glanced over at the folder of newspaper clippings. Heading back for the Duke's funeral, she asked quietly, and Alexander realized she had recognized him despite his attempt at discretion. Yes, he said simply, bracing himself for the inevitable follow-up questions or requests for photographs. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. I met him once at a veterans charity event. Genuine man. Really listen when you talk to him, you know? Not many of his sort who actually pay attention to ordinary people. Alexander felt his throat tighten. He was special that way. My son served in Afghanistan, she continued. Came back with PTSD, couldn't find work, ended up homeless for a while. The Duke's organization helped him get back on his feet. Never made a big show of it, never wanted publicity, just did the work. The woman returned her laptop, and Alexander stared out the window at the clouds below. This was what he had missed during his 3 years away, he realized. Not just the family connections, but the understanding of his uncle's real impact, the lives he had touched, the quiet good he had done without fanfare or recognition. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from Charlotte. Landing information has been compromised. Photographers at Heathrow. James suggests alternative arrival arrangements. Call when you can. He sighed and scrolled through his contacts until he found James's number. The call was answered immediately. "Your Highness," James said, and Alexander noticed he still used the formal address despite everything that had changed. "Alexander," he corrected gently. "What's the situation?" "Typical circus, I'm afraid. Word of your arrival has spread, and there are reporters and photographers at every major terminal. I can arrange for you to be met by diplomatic security and escorted through a private exit, but that will require coordination with palace security, which means Father will know I'm here before I'm ready for that conversation," Alexander finished. "Precisely. Alternatively, I can have a car meet you at the standard arrival area, and you can walk through the media presence. Brief statement or no statement, your choice. It will be chaotic, but it puts you in control of the narrative from the beginning." Alexander considered his options. 3 years ago, he would have automatically chosen the path that avoided media attention, that minimized disruption and protected royal dignity. But 3 years of living as a private citizen had taught him something about the value of direct communication, of saying what you meant without layers of protocol and interpretation. "I'll walk through," he said. "No statement, but I won't hide either. Can you have someone meet me after I clear customs?" "Of course." "Alexander, are you prepared for the questions they'll ask?" Alexander thought about the questions he would face, about his reasons for returning, about his relationship with his father, about whether this visit represented a permanent return to royal life or just a temporary appearance for family obligations, about his book, his exile, his plans for the future. "I'm prepared to say nothing," he said, "but I want to be seen. I want people to know I came home for Uncle Edward." The plane began its descent toward London, and Alexander watched the familiar landscape emerge through the clouds. The Thames snaking through the city center, the landmarks he had grown up among, the sprawling metropolis that had been both home and prison for the first 29 years of his life. When the plane touched down at Heathrow, Alexander could see the crowd of reporters and photographers gathered beyond the windows of the arrival terminal. Cameras with long lenses were already pointing in the direction of the plane, and he could see news vans lined up in the airport's pickup area. He gathered his 2 small bags, the same 2 suitcases he had left Britain with 3 years earlier, and made his way through the plane's exit. The other passengers seemed to sense something unusual was happening, some recognizing him, and others simply picking up on the tension of the moment. Customs and immigration were handled quickly and quietly, with officials who had clearly been briefed on his arrival. Within 30 minutes of landing, Alexander found himself standing at the final barrier before the public arrival area, looking out at a crowd of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. James appeared at his elbow, looking exactly as he had 3 years earlier, except for some new gray in his hair. "Last chance to reconsider the private exit," he said quietly. Alexander shook his head. "Let's get this over with." The moment he stepped into the public area, the noise was overwhelming. Dozens of voices shouting questions, camera flashes creating a strobe light effect, the mechanical clicking of camera shutters creating a constant background percussion. Alexander kept walking steadily toward the exit, James beside him, and 2 discreet security personnel clearing a path through the crowd. "Prince Alexander, why are you returning now? Your Highness, will you be reconciling with your father? Are you back permanently, or just for the funeral? What would you say to critics who called your book a betrayal? Do you regret leaving the royal family?" Alexander kept his expression neutral and his pace steady, but he couldn't block out the questions entirely. Each one hit like a small reminder of the complex web of expectations and judgments he had walked away from, and the equally complex web of relationships and responsibilities he was walking back into. Near the exit, one voice rose above the others, clear and direct. "What would the Duke of Westmarch want to say to the British people about your return?" Alexander stopped walking. The question caught him off guard, not because it was intrusive, but because it was exactly the right question. He turned toward the reporter who had asked it, a young woman with a serious expression and a small digital recorder held out toward him. For a moment, the crowd quieted, sensing that he might actually respond. Alexander looked at the faces surrounding him, most hidden behind cameras or notebooks, but all focused on him with an intensity that felt both familiar and strange. "My uncle believed in forgiveness," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for the closest reporters to hear. "He believed in family, in service, and in doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. I'm here because he deserves to be honored by the people who loved him, regardless of politics or family complications." He paused, looking directly at the young reporter who had asked the question. He would want people to focus on the good he did, the lives he touched, and the example he set, not on whatever drama my presence might create. With that, Alexander turned and walked the final 50 feet to the exit, where a discreet black car was waiting. The questions continued behind him, but he didn't look back. The drive from Heathrow into central London took over an hour due to traffic, and Alexander spent most of it looking out the window at a city that felt both unchanged and completely different. The physical landscape was the same, but he was seeing it through different eyes now. Not as a prince moving through his domain, but as someone returning home after a long absence, uncertain of his welcome. His hotel, the Langham, was a Victorian establishment that had hosted royalty, celebrities, and wealthy travelers for over a century. James had chosen it specifically because it offered both luxury and discretion, with private entrances and staff trained to handle high-profile guests without fuss. Alexander was checked in through a side entrance, avoiding the small crowd of photographers that had already gathered at the main entrance. His suite on the 8th floor overlooked Regent Street and offered views of the BBC broadcasting house across the street, a reminder that his every move would be watched and analyzed by the media. Once alone in his room, Alexander sat on the edge of the bed and called Charlotte. "You made it," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I saw the footage from the airport. You handled it well." "It felt surreal," Alexander admitted, "like stepping back into someone else's life." "How are you feeling?" "About being back, about seeing everyone tomorrow." Alexander considered the question. "Nervous. Sad about Uncle Edward. Confused about what this all means for the future. And guilty about staying away so long." "Alex, can I ask you something? Are you happy in Canada?" "Really happy. Not just content or satisfied, but genuinely happy." The question surprised him with its directness. Charlotte had always been good at cutting through complexity to reach the heart of matters. "Yes," he said after thinking about it. "I'm happy there. Not all the time, not without complications, but yes. I like the person I've become. I like the work I do. I like having real relationships with people who know me as just Alex." "Then don't let this week make you feel like you have to choose between that happiness and your family," Charlotte said firmly. "Uncle Edward wouldn't want you to sacrifice your well-being for duty, and honestly, I don't want that either. I want you back in my life, but I want you to be the version of yourself that you've worked so hard to become." After they hung up, Alexander ordered room service and spent the evening going through the formal program for the following week. The lying-in state at Westminster Hall would begin tomorrow morning, followed by 3 days of public viewing before the funeral on Friday. He would attend the lying-in state ceremony as a family member, but his participation in the other events would depend on conversations that hadn't happened yet with his father and mother. James had scheduled a family meeting for tomorrow afternoon, after the lying-in state ceremony. It would be the first time Alexander had been in the same room with both his parents since his departure 3 years earlier. The prospect filled him with equal parts anticipation and dread. At 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock at his door. Alexander opened it to find a hotel staff member with an envelope bearing the royal cipher. "A message was delivered for you, sir," the staff member said discreetly. Inside was a handwritten note from his mother. "Alexander, I'm glad you came home, even if it's just for this week. Your uncle would be so pleased. I hope we can find time to talk properly while you're here. All my love, Mother." Alexander read the note 3 times, looking for hidden meanings or subtle reproaches, but finding only what appeared to be genuine warmth and invitation. His mother had always been the family peacemaker, the one who worked to maintain relationships, even when official protocols made them difficult. He sat down at the hotel's writing desk and composed his own note in response. Mother, thank you for your kindness. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow and to honoring Uncle Edward together. With love, Alexander. He called the front desk and arranged for the note to be delivered to Kensington Palace that evening, then prepared for bed. Tomorrow would begin the complex process of navigating family relationships, public expectations, and personal boundaries that he had spent 3 years learning to live without. But tonight, for the first time since receiving the news of Uncle Edward's death, Alexander felt like he had made the right decision in coming home. Westminster Hall stood in somber dignity as Alexander approached the ancient building where his uncle's body would lie in state for 3 days before the funeral. The Gothic architecture, unchanged for centuries, seemed to hold the weight of all the history that had passed through its doors, all the monarchs and nobles who had been honored within its walls. Alexander had arrived early, before the official family gathering, wanting a few private moments to prepare himself for what would be an emotionally and politically charged day. The security arrangements were complex, involving coordination between several law enforcement agencies and the royal protection officers who had once been responsible for his safety. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, who had been Alexander's personal protection officer during his final 2 years as a working royal, met him at the staff entrance to Westminster Hall. She looked exactly the same, professional and alert, though he noticed she seemed uncertain about how to address him. Alexander, he said before she could struggle with the protocol. Just Alexander. Alexander, she repeated, offering a small smile. It's good to see you. I'm sorry about the Duke. He was a good man. Thank you. How has it been these past few days? Sarah fell in a step beside him as they walked toward the main hall. Complicated. The public response has been overwhelming. People have been queuing since yesterday evening to pay their respects when public viewing begins this afternoon. But the media attention around your return has added layers. I imagine Father isn't pleased about the circus. The king is focused entirely on honoring his brother, Sarah said diplomatically. But, yes, there have been challenges with media management. They entered Westminster Hall through a side door, and Alexander stopped short at the sight before him. The massive medieval hall had been transformed into a place of solemn beauty. His uncle's coffin sat on a raised platform in the center of the space, draped with his personal standard and surrounded by flowers. 4 guards in ceremonial uniform stood at the corners, their heads bowed in respect. The size of the space, with its hammer beam roof soaring overhead, made the single coffin seem both magnificent and heartbreakingly small. Alexander had been to state funerals before, had participated in royal ceremonies that filled this same hall with hundreds of people and elaborate pageantry. But seeing his uncle here alone, in the quiet dignity of death, felt more powerful than any grand spectacle. Would you like a few minutes? Sarah asked quietly. Alexander nodded and walked slowly toward the coffin. His footsteps echoed in the vast space, each one a small reminder of how many people had walked this same path over the centuries, coming to pay respects to loved ones and leaders. Standing beside Uncle Edward's coffin, Alexander felt the full weight of his 3-year absence. All the conversations they would never have, all the guidance he could have sought during difficult decisions, all the simple family moments they had missed because of pride and politics and the complicated calculus of royal duty versus personal freedom. I'm sorry I stayed away so long, he whispered, feeling slightly foolish but needing to say the words. I'm sorry I let you down. I'm sorry you died thinking I didn't care about you. The silence that followed felt heavy with unresolved grief, but also with something else. Forgiveness, perhaps, or simply the peace that came from finally being present when presence mattered. Alexander stood there for 20 minutes, not praying exactly, but simply being with his uncle one last time. When he heard voices approaching from a main entrance, he knew the rest of the family was arriving for the official ceremony. Charlotte entered first, dressed in a black coat, and hat that made her look older than her 24 years, but also strikingly dignified. When she saw Alexander, her face lit up with genuine joy, and she walked quickly across the hall to embrace him. "I wasn't sure you'd really come until I saw you standing there," she said, holding him tightly enough that he could feel her trembling slightly. "I'm here," he said simply. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Their parents entered together, moving with the careful coordination of two people who had spent decades appearing in public as a united front. King William looked older than his 54 years, his hair more gray than brown now, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when Alexander left. Queen Catherine moved beside him with the same graceful composure she had maintained throughout her years as a royal, but Alexander could see the strain in the set of her shoulders. When his parents reached the center of the hall, the four of them stood together for the first time in 3 years. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Queen Catherine stepped forward and embraced Alexander warmly. "My dear boy," she said, and her voice carried none of the reproach or coldness he had feared. "I'm so glad you came home." King William stood watching this reunion with an expression Alexander couldn't read. Not angry exactly, but not welcoming either. Finally, he extended his hand formally. "Alexander," he said, shaking his son's hand as he might greet any other member of the extended royal family. The formal tone stung, but Alexander had expected it. His relationship with his father had been strained long before his departure, built on fundamental disagreements about duty, service, and what meant to be royal in the modern world. 3 years of separation, and the publication of his memoir had only deepened those rifts. "Father," Alexander replied, matching the formal tone, "thank you for including me in this week's arrangements." The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived shortly after, along with several other clergy members who would participate in the ceremony. Alexander found himself standing slightly apart from his family during the brief service that would officially begin the lying-in state period, not quite included in their tight formation, but not entirely separate either. The Archbishop spoke about Uncle Edward's life of service, his dedication to military veterans, his quiet charity work that had touched thousands of lives without seeking publicity or recognition. Alexander listened to the familiar rhythms of royal ceremony, the formal language that somehow managed to capture both the man's public achievements and hint at his private character. When the service concluded, the family members took turns approaching the coffin for private goodbyes. Alexander went last, aware that cameras outside would capture every moment of this public ritual. He placed his hand briefly on the coffin and said a silent goodbye to the uncle who had never stopped believing in him. As they prepared to leave Westminster Hall, Queen Catherine touched Alexander's arm gently. "We're having a private family tea this afternoon, before the evening events. Just immediate family, no staff or official business. Would you join us?" Alexander looked at his father, trying to gauge his reaction to this invitation. King William's expression remained carefully neutral, but he nodded slightly. "Yes," Alexander said. "I'd like that." The family tea was held in the private sitting room at Kensington Palace, the same room where Alexander had spent countless childhood hours playing games with Charlotte, reading with his mother, and having serious conversations about his future with his father. Being back in this space felt like stepping into a photograph from his past. The conversation was initially stilted, focusing on safe topics like the weather, the public response to Uncle Edward's death, and the logistics of the upcoming funeral. But gradually, as they shared memories of Uncle Edward, the atmosphere became more natural. "Do you remember," Charlotte said, "when he taught us to fish at Balmoral, and Alex caught that enormous trout, but insisted on releasing it because he said it was too beautiful to kill?" Queen Catherine smiled. "Your uncle was so proud of that. He said it showed real character, choosing compassion over trophy hunting. He always saw the best in people," Alexander said quietly, "even when they didn't deserve it." King William looked up from his teacup. "Is that aimed at me?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Alexander realized this was the opening he had both dreaded and hoped for. "No, father. It's aimed at me. Uncle Edward never stopped believing I could find my way back to the family, even after everything that happened. Even after the book, after the interviews, after staying away for 3 years. He kept sending birthday cards, Christmas cards, little notes when there was family news. He never gave up on me. And yet you gave up on us, King William said, but without the anger Alexander had expected. Instead, he sounded tired, sad. I gave up on the institution, Alexander corrected. I never gave up on you as people. But I couldn't separate the two anymore. Every conversation we had was filtered through royal protocol, through what was best for the monarchy, through maintaining public image. I felt like I was disappearing into a role that was killing me slowly. Queen Catherine reached across the small table and took both her husband's hand and her son's hand. Can we try to separate them now? Can we try to be a family first, royals second, at least while we're grieving Edward? King William studied his son's face for a long moment. You look well, he said finally, healthier than when you left. Canada agrees with you. It does, Alexander said honestly. I've found work I care about, friendships that aren't based on what I can do for people, a sense of purpose that comes from my own choices rather than inherited obligation. I'm not the same person who left 3 years ago. And that person, the one you've become, is he someone who might consider returning to royal duties? King William asked. Charlotte looked between her father and brother with obvious tension. This was the conversation she had been both hoping for and dreading, Alexander realized. She wanted her family reunited, but she also understood that forced reunification might destroy the progress Alexander had made toward genuine happiness. I don't know, Alexander said honestly. A week ago, I would have said absolutely not. But being here, seeing how much the family has struggled, understanding what Charlotte has had to take on alone, it's more complicated than I want it to be. The monarchy needs to evolve, Queen Catherine said carefully. We all know that. Perhaps having someone with your perspective, your experience of life outside the institution, could help guide that evolution. Or perhaps, King William added, it could provide exactly the kind of authentic voice that critics say we lack. Alexander felt the familiar pull of family duty, the sense that his personal happiness was selfish when measured against institutional needs and his sister's burden. But he also felt the hard-won wisdom of 3 years of independence, the knowledge that sacrificing his mental health for duty would ultimately serve no one well. Can I ask you something, Father? Do you think Uncle Edward would want me to give up the life I've built to return to a role that nearly broke me before? King William was quiet for a long time, staring into his teacup as if it might contain answers to impossible questions. Your uncle always said that the best service comes from people who choose it freely, who understand its cost, and embrace it anyway. He would want you to be happy, Alexander. But he would also want you to consider how your gifts might serve something larger than yourself. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered territory that the family hadn't explored in years. Alexander struggles with anxiety and depression during his royal years. Charlotte's loneliness and the pressure she felt to be perfect in her brother's absence. Their parents' marriage, which had weathered decades of public scrutiny and private challenges. The future of the monarchy in an era when its relevance was increasingly questioned. By the time they finished, nothing had been resolved, but everything had been acknowledged. Alexander had agreed to stay for the full week, to participate in the funeral and the family events surrounding it. Beyond that, he couldn't make any commitments. As he prepared to leave for his hotel, Queen Catherine walked him to the door. Whatever you decide about the future, she said, I want you to know that we've missed you every single day. Not Prince Alexander, not the heir and spare dynamic, not what you represented for the institution. We've missed you, our son, our brother. That love doesn't come with conditions or expectations. That evening, Alexander sat in his hotel room reading news coverage of his return. The headlines range from hopeful speculation about royal reconciliation to cynical analysis of the timing and motivations behind his appearance. But mixed in with the inevitable media noise were stories that reminded him why Uncle Edward's life had mattered. A veteran who credited the Duke's charity with saving him from suicide. A community garden project that had transformed a struggling neighborhood. Scholarship programs that had sent dozens of young people to university. Quiet acts of kindness that had never been publicized, but had changed individual lives. Alexander thought about his own work in Canada, the environmental projects he had helped coordinate, the relationships he had built with colleagues who valued his contributions rather than his titles. Then he thought about the conversation with his family, about Charlotte's isolation and his father's obvious struggle with the changing role of monarchy. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Charlotte's name appeared on the screen. "How are you feeling about today?" she asked. "Emotionally exhausted," Alexander said honestly, "but also strangely hopeful. We actually talked to each other, really talked for the first time in years." "What did you think of Father's suggestion about returning to royal duties?" Alexander considered his answer carefully. "I think he's right that the monarchy needs to change. I think he's right that my experience outside the institution might offer valuable perspective. But I also think the system that nearly broke me before hasn't fundamentally changed, and I'm not sure it can change enough to accommodate who I've become." "What if it could change?" Charlotte asked. "What if we could find a way to modernize royal duty so that it felt authentic instead of performative? What if you could serve the public good while still maintaining the independence and genuine relationships you've found?" "That's a big what if, Charlotte." "I know, but Alex, I've been thinking about this for 3 years. The monarchy's biggest weakness right now is that it feels disconnected from real people, from real problems, from the way most people actually live their lives. You could bridge that gap in a way that none of US can because you've actually lived on both sides of it." Alexander walked to his window and looked out at the London streets below, at the ordinary people going about their evening routines. 3 years ago, this view would have represented everything he was trying to escape. Tonight, it looked like a puzzle he might be uniquely qualified to help solve. But solutions, he had learned, required more than good intentions. They required sustainable structures, genuine commitment, and the kind of institutional change that royal families had historically resisted. Whether that kind of change was possible remained to be seen. The morning of Uncle Edward's funeral dawned gray and misty, with the kind of London weather that seemed designed for solemn occasions. Alexander stood at his hotel window watching the early crowds gathering along the funeral route. Ordinary people who had risen before dawn to say goodbye to a royal who had somehow managed to connect with their lives. He had barely slept, spending most of the night thinking about the conversations of the past 3 days. Since the family tea on Tuesday, he had participated in several private family events, including a memorial service at Windsor Chapel that was attended only by close relatives and Uncle Edward's longtime staff. Each interaction had revealed more layers of the complicated dynamics he had left behind and the changes that had occurred during his absence. The most surprising discovery was how much the family had grown to understand his original decision to leave. Even King William had admitted, during a quiet conversation the previous evening, that the pressures of royal life had become more intense rather than less so during the 3 years since Alexander's departure. The constant media scrutiny, the increased expectations for royal transparency, and the growing public questioning of the monarchy's relevance had created a pressure cooker environment that made Alexander's original complaints seem prophetic rather than petulant. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Alexander opened it to find James holding a garment bag and wearing an expression of careful neutrality. "Your uniform, sir," James said, then corrected himself. "Alexander, I had it retrieved from storage at Kensington Palace. The king thought you might want to wear it today." Alexander accepted the bag with mixed feelings. Inside was his dress uniform from the parachute regiment, complete with the medals and insignia he had earned during his military service. It had been nearly 4 years since he had worn it, and seeing the familiar fabric and decorations brought back memories of the parts of royal duty he had actually enjoyed. His military service had been the one area where Alexander felt he had made a real contribution, where his royal status had been secondary to his competence as a soldier and officer. The months he spent deployed with his regiment had been among the happiest of his adult life, surrounded by people who judged him on his performance rather than his pedigree. "Did Father say anything else about the uniform?" Alexander asked as he examined the carefully preserved garment. "The king said that whatever disagreements exist between you about royal duty, Your military service was exemplary, and Uncle Edward would want you honored as the soldier you were, not just the prince you were born to be." Alexander felt his throat tighten. This gesture from his father, acknowledging his military achievements even in the midst of their ongoing personal and political disagreements, was perhaps the most generous thing King William had done since his return. "Tell father thank you," Alexander said, "and tell him I'm honored to wear it today." An hour later, Alexander stood in the anteroom at Westminster Abbey, wearing his uniform and waiting with the rest of the family for the funeral service to begin. The uniform felt both familiar and strange, like putting on a costume from a play he had once performed in, but had almost forgotten. Charlotte appeared at his side, resplendent in a black coat dress with the family's ceremonial jewelry. "You look like yourself again," she said quietly. "Which self?" Alexander asked with a slight smile. "The prince, the soldier, or the Canadian environmental activist?" "All of them," she said seriously. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. You don't have to choose just one identity. Maybe the future of royal service is exactly that kind of complexity." Before Alexander could respond, the processional music began, and the family moved into their positions for the slow walk down the Abbey's main aisle. Alexander found himself walking behind his parents and beside Charlotte, visible to the hundreds of dignitaries, family members, and specially invited guests who filled the ancient cathedral. The service itself was magnificent and deeply personal. Uncle Edward's military colleagues spoke about his leadership and courage. Representatives from his charitable organizations described his hands-on approach to helping others. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a sermon that managed to honor both the Duke's public achievements and his private character. But it was a moment when a young veteran, barely 25 years old and clearly nervous about speaking in such a formal setting, rose to deliver a reading that Alexander felt the full impact of his uncle's life. The young man, who had lost his leg in Afghanistan and struggled with depression afterward, spoke about how Uncle Edward's charity had not only provided practical support, but had visited him personally in the hospital, had attended his wedding, and had become a friend rather than just a benefactor. "The Duke taught me that service isn't about grand gestures or public recognition," the veteran said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "It's about showing up for people when they need you, about using whatever privileges you have to make other people's lives better. He never made me feel like a charity case. He made me feel like a human being whose life had value." Alexander looked around the Abbey and realized that this was what he had been missing during his 3 years of self-imposed exile. Not the pageantry or the protocol, but the opportunity to use his unique position to make a real difference in individual lives. The question was whether he could find a way to do that kind of work within the royal system, or whether it required the kind of independence he had found in Canada. After the service, the family accompanied Uncle Edward's body to Westmarch Castle for the private burial. The drive through the English countryside was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts about what they had lost and what might come next. Westmarch Castle had been Uncle Edward's private retreat, a place where he could garden, read, and host informal gatherings away from the formality of official royal residences. The burial service was held in the small family cemetery behind the castle, among the graves of previous dukes and duchesses of Westmarch dating back 3 centuries. Alexander had spent many childhood weekends at Westmarch, learning to ride horses in the estate's paddocks, helping Uncle Edward tend his famous rose garden, and listening to stories about family history that were never included in official royal biographies. Standing in the cemetery, watching his uncle's coffin being lowered into the ground, felt like the end of more than one man's life. It felt like the end of a particular version of royal family identity, one that had valued private relationships as much as public duty. After the burial, the family gathered in Uncle Edward's library for what had become their most honest conversation yet. Without the pressure of media attention or official protocol, they could finally address the questions that had been hovering around Alexander's return. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," King William began, addressing his son directly, "about the monarchy needing to evolve. about finding ways to modernize royal service. What if we created something new? A role that would allow you to serve the institution while maintaining the independence and authenticity you found. Alexander leaned forward in his chair, intrigued despite himself. What kind of role? An ambassador position, Queen Catherine suggested. Someone who could work on projects that bridge the gap between traditional royal duty and contemporary social problems. Environmental issues, mental health advocacy, supporting veterans, and military families. Areas where your background and personal experience would be genuine assets rather than just inherited obligations. Charlotte nodded enthusiastically. You could maintain your residence in Canada, work with organizations there as well as here. Split your time, choose your projects, work in partnership with the institution rather than being controlled by it. Alexander felt the familiar tug of possibility, the sense that maybe there was a way to have both the independence he treasured and the family connections he had missed. But he also felt the hard-won caution of someone who had been burned by institutional promises before. What would that look like practically, he asked. Who would I report to? How will my work be funded? What happens when my priorities conflict with official royal policy? Those are exactly the kinds of questions we need to work out, King William said. But, Alexander, the monarchy's biggest weakness right now is its perceived distance from real people and real problems. You could help bridge that gap in ways that none of us can, because you've actually lived outside the system. You understand both worlds. The key, Queen Catherine added, would be ensuring that this isn't just a cosmetic change designed to bring you back into traditional royal duty. It would have to be a genuinely new approach to royal service, one that acknowledges that the old models don't work for everyone. Alexander spent the next 2 hours asking detailed questions about logistics, funding, accountability, and the boundaries of such a role. His parents and Charlotte had clearly thought seriously about this proposal, working out many of the practical details that would be essential to making it successful. But the most important question remained unanswered: whether Alexander could trust the institution that had nearly broken him before to honor a new kind of arrangement, especially when political pressures or media crises inevitably arose. I need time to think about this, he said finally. And I need to talk to people in Canada, my colleagues, my friends, the people who have become my support system during these 3 years. This isn't just my decision anymore. I built a life there, made commitments to people and projects. Of course, Charlotte said quickly. We're not asking for an immediate answer. We're just asking you to consider the possibility that there might be a way to have both the independence you need and the family connections we all want. How long do you think you'll need? King William asked. Alexander considered the question. A month, maybe 2. Long enough to have real conversations with the people in Canada who have invested in me. Long enough to understand what this proposed role would actually mean in practice. Long enough to be sure that everyone's expectations are realistic. That's fair, Queen Catherine said. And, Alexander, whatever you decide, I want you to know that having you here this week, being able to grieve as a family, and remember Edward together, has meant everything to us. The conversation concluded with tentative plans for Alexander to return to Canada the following morning, with an understanding that they would continue discussing the proposed new role through regular phone calls and possibly another visit in a month or 2. That evening, Alexander had dinner with Charlotte at a small restaurant in Covent Garden, one of the few places in London where they could have a reasonably private conversation without attracting too much attention. It was the first time they'd been alone together since his return, and the first opportunity for completely honest sibling conversation. Are you seriously considering their proposal? Charlotte asked over dessert. I think so, Alexander said slowly. It addresses many of the concerns that drove me away in the first place. The question is whether it's sustainable, whether the institution can actually change enough to make it work. What would you miss most about your life in Canada? Alexander thought about the question seriously. The simplicity, I think. The ability to make decisions based on what I think is right rather than what's politically expedient. The friendships that aren't complicated by protocol or hierarchy. The sense that my achievements are my own rather than products of inherited privilege. And what would you gain by coming back, even in this new kind of role? the ability to work on problems at a scale that individual action can't reach, access to resources and networks that could amplify the kind of work I care about, and honestly, Charlotte, the chance to help share the burden that's been crushing you for the past 3 years. Charlotte reached across the table and took his hand. Alex, I need you to promise me something. Don't come back just because you feel guilty about what I've had to handle alone. Don't sacrifice your happiness to solve our family's problems. Come back only if you genuinely believe this new arrangement could make you fulfilled and effective, not just dutiful. That's exactly what Uncle Edward would have said, Alexander realized. Which is how I know it's the right advice, Charlotte replied with a sad smile. They walked back to Alexander's hotel through the quiet London streets, past the landmarks that had shaped their childhood and the institutions that would continue to define their family's future regardless of the choices Alexander made in the coming weeks. At the hotel entrance, Charlotte hugged him tightly. I love you whether you come back or stay away, she said. But I really hope we can find a way to make this work because I've missed my big brother more than I could say. Alone in his room, Alexander began the process of preparing for his return to Canada. But instead of feeling like an escape, it felt like the beginning of the most important decision-making process of his adult life. For the first time since leaving 3 years earlier, he could imagine a future that included both his family and his independence, both royal service and personal authenticity. Whether such a future was actually possible remained to be seen, but Uncle Edward's funeral had given him something he hadn't expected. Hope that the institution he had walked away from might be capable of the kind of change that could welcome him home. 2 months after Uncle Edward's funeral, Alexander stood in his Vancouver apartment looking at 2 plane tickets on his kitchen table. One was for a flight to London scheduled for the following week, purchased after weeks of careful negotiation and planning. The other was a return ticket to Vancouver, purchased as what his therapist called an emotional safety net, a reminder that he always had the choice to come back to the life he had built in Canada. The weeks since his return from London had been filled with the most difficult conversations of his adult life. Long phone calls with his family, working out the details of the proposed new royal role. Honest discussions with his colleagues at the environmental nonprofit, explaining the opportunity he was considering and what it would mean for the projects they had been working on together. Most importantly, sessions with Dr. Sarah Chun, the therapist who had helped him navigate his transition to Canadian life and who was now helping him evaluate whether returning to royal service, even in a modified form, was psychologically sustainable. The key question, Dr. Chun had said during their session the previous week, isn't whether you love your family or whether you want to help with the monarchy's problems. The key question is whether you can maintain your sense of self and your emotional well-being while taking on this role, given your history with the institution. Alexander had spent considerable time developing what Dr. Chun called his non-negotiables, the essential elements that would need to be in place for him to consider returning to royal service. First, he would maintain his residence in Vancouver and spend at least 4 months per year there, ensuring that his Canadian life remained real rather than just nostalgic. Second, he would have complete autonomy over his project choices and public statements within his areas of responsibility, with the understanding that he would consult with the family on major initiatives, but wouldn't be subject to prior approval for his day-to-day work. Third, he would return to Canada immediately if the arrangement stopped working for his mental health, regardless of any institutional inconvenience such a departure might cause. These requirements had led to weeks of delicate negotiation with his father and the palace bureaucracy. King William had initially balked at the level of independence Alexander was demanding, arguing that royal service required coordination and consistency with overall family messaging. But Charlotte had supported Alexander's position firmly, pointing out that the whole purpose of creating a new role was to bring authentic, independent voices into royal service, not to create another traditional position with different window dressing. The breakthrough had come during a video call with the entire family 3 weeks earlier, when Queen Catherine had made an observation that reframed the entire discussion. "We're trying to solve this as if it's a personnel problem," she had said. "But it's really an institutional evolution problem. The monarchy needs to learn how to work with people who have genuine expertise and independent perspectives, not just people who fit traditional royal molds. Alexander's requirements aren't unreasonable demands from a difficult son. They're the minimum conditions that any competent professional would require before joining an organization. That perspective had allowed them to move forward with concrete planning. Alexander would hold the title of Duke of Environmental and Social Innovation, a newly created position that would allow him to work on climate change initiatives, mental health advocacy, and veteran support programs. He would split his time between Britain and Canada, maintaining offices in both countries and working with partner organizations on both sides of the Atlantic. Financially, the arrangement would be supported through a combination of royal estate funds and partnerships with private foundations and corporate sponsors, allowing Alexander to work independently while ensuring that taxpayers weren't funding what critics might see as a vanity project for a prodigal prince. The media strategy had been carefully planned as well. Rather than announcing the new arrangement through traditional palace communications, Alexander would return to London quietly and spend 2 weeks working with existing charitable organizations, demonstrating his commitment through actions before making any public statements about his new role. But all of the careful planning couldn't address Alexander's deeper emotional uncertainties about whether he could trust himself and his family to maintain healthy boundaries when the inevitable pressures of royal service reasserted themselves. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation of the plane tickets. Charlotte's name appeared on the screen, along with a photo of her laughing during their last weekend together at Westmarch Castle, taken just a few days before Uncle Edward's death. "How are you feeling about next week?" she asked, dispensing with preliminary greetings in a way that had become natural during their weekly phone calls over the past 2 months. "Nervous, excited, scared that we're all kidding ourselves about how sustainable this will be," Alexander said honestly. "Those sound like exactly the right feelings," Charlotte replied. "If you weren't nervous, it would mean you weren't taking the risks seriously. If you weren't excited, it would mean the opportunity wasn't genuinely appealing. And if you weren't worried about sustainability, it would mean you hadn't learned anything from your previous experience with royal duty. Has Father said anything about his expectations for my first few weeks back? He's been very careful to emphasize that this is an experimental period for everyone," Charlotte said. "He knows that if he puts too much pressure on you too quickly, the whole arrangement will fall apart. But, Alex, I can tell he's genuinely excited about what you might accomplish. Yesterday, he spent 20 minutes explaining to the Prime Minister why your environmental work could be crucial for the monarchy's relevance with younger generations." Alexander felt a familiar mix of warmth and wariness at evidence of his father's support. King William's enthusiasm was encouraging, but it also raised concerns about whether expectations were being set at levels that would be impossible to meet. "What about the press? Any indication of how they're planning to cover my return?" "Mixed as expected," Charlotte said. "The supportive papers are treating it as a heartwarming story of family reconciliation and royal modernization. The skeptical papers are questioning your motives and suggesting this is just a publicity stunt to rehabilitate your image. The tabloids are mostly focused on whether you'll get married now that you're back in the public eye." Alexander laughed despite his anxiety. "Well, at least some things never change. Actually, that raises something I want to talk to you about. Have you thought about how returning to royal service might affect your personal life? Dating, relationships, the possibility of eventual marriage, and family?" The question caught Alexander off guard. During his 3 years in Canada, he had dated occasionally, but had avoided serious relationships, partly because he was still figuring out his own identity and partly because he wasn't sure how to explain his unusual background and uncertain future to potential partners. "Honestly, I've been so focused on the professional and family aspects of this decision that I haven't really considered the personal implications," he admitted. "It's something to think about," Charlotte said gently. "One of the hardest parts of royal life is how it affects the people you love who didn't choose it for themselves. If you're planning to build a life that includes both royal service and personal happiness, you'll need to figure out how to protect future relationships from the pressures that come with the territory." After they hung up, Alexander walked to his window and looked out at the Vancouver skyline. In a few days, this view would become a memory he returned to during visits rather than his daily reality. The thought brought both sadness and anticipation. His doorbell rang, and Alexander opened it to find his neighbor Mrs. Patterson, a 70-year-old retired teacher who had become one of his closest friends in Canada. She was holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing the expression of someone with something important to say. "I heard through the building gossip network that you're moving back to England," she said without preamble, inviting herself into his apartment as she had dozens of times over the past 3 years. "Not permanently," Alexander said quickly. "This arrangement means I'll be spending part of my time here and part of my time there." Mrs. Patterson settled into the armchair that had become her usual spot during their frequent afternoon conversations. "Alexander, dear, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Are you doing this because you want to, or because you feel like you should?" The directness of the question reminded Alexander why Mrs. Patterson had become such an important part of his support system. She had no investment in royal protocol or family dynamics, no agenda beyond genuine concern for his well-being. "Both, I think," he said after considering her question seriously. "I want to contribute to solving problems that I care about at a scale that my individual efforts can't reach. I want to be part of my family's life again, especially Charlotte's. I want to honor Uncle Edward's memory by doing the kind of service work he believed in. But I also feel responsible for the burden Charlotte has been carrying alone, and I feel guilty about walking away when things got difficult. And which motivation do you think is stronger?" Alexander sat down across from her and thought about the question. A year ago, I would have said the guilt and responsibility were driving everything. But honestly, after these 2 months of planning and negotiation, I think I'm primarily motivated by genuine excitement about what I might be able to accomplish. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. Because, dear, you've done such important work here these past 3 years. Not just the environmental projects, but the personal growth, learning who you are when you're not performing a role for other people. It would be a shame to lose all of that progress by returning to a situation that makes you feel trapped again. How do I make sure that doesn't happen? By remembering that you always have choices, even when it doesn't feel like it," she said firmly. "You're not the same person who left England 3 years ago. You're stronger now, more grounded in your own values, better at setting boundaries. Trust those skills, use them, and remember that the people who really love you want you to be happy and healthy, not just dutiful." That evening, Alexander had dinner with his colleagues from the environmental nonprofit, a group of dedicated professionals who had become genuine friends rather than just work associates. The dinner was both a goodbye celebration and a planning session, since Alexander would continue to work with the organization on joint project between their Canadian operations and his new royal initiatives. Dr. Marcus Webb, the organization's director, raised his glass for a toast. "To Alexander, who taught us that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is insist on being authentic in a world that rewards performance. May you bring that same authenticity to your new role, and may you remember that you always have a home here when you need one." The toast moved Alexander more than he had expected. These people had welcomed him when he was essentially a refugee from his own life, had valued his contributions without reference to his background, and had supported his decision to return to royal service, even though it meant losing a valued team member. "I need all of you to promise me something," Alexander said, looking around the table at faces that had become dear to him. "If I start to sound like a different person during our phone calls, if the work I'm doing stops feeling authentic, if you sense that I'm sacrificing my values for institutional expectations, I need you to call me on it. I need people in my life who will tell me the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable." The promises that followed were heartfelt and specific. Dr. Webb committed to monthly check-in calls focused not on work updates, but on Alexander's personal well-being. Sarah Kim, the project manager who had become his closest confidant, promised to visit him in London within 3 months to observe firsthand how the new arrangement was affecting him. Tom Bradley, the communications director who had helped Alexander learn to speak authentically about environmental issues, committed to reviewing all of Alexander's major speeches and public statements to ensure they remained true to his voice rather than becoming generic royal pronouncements. 3 days later, Alexander stood in the Vancouver airport, saying goodbye to the city that had given him the gift of discovering who he was without a crown. The departure felt different from his original flight to London for Uncle Edward's funeral. Then, he had been returning to the past to resolve unfinished business. Now, he was moving toward a future that he had helped design, carrying with him the lessons and relationships that had sustained him during his years of exile. The flight to London gave Alexander time to review the detailed plans that had been developed for his first month back in royal service. He would spend 2 weeks working quietly with 3 different charitable organizations, learning about their operations and contributing to their work without any media attention. Then, he would participate in a carefully planned public appearance, announcing his new role and outlining his priorities for the coming year. The approach was designed to demonstrate his commitment through actions before words, establishing credibility through competence rather than ceremonial authority. It was exactly the kind of authentic approach to public service that Alexander had always believed the monarchy needed, and exactly the opposite of the traditional royal method of announcing initiatives with great fanfare before proving their substance. As the plane began its descent toward Heathrow, Alexander felt a sense of completion rather than return. He was not going back to the life he had left 3 years earlier. He was carrying forward the person he had become during his exile, bringing Canadian sensibilities and hard-won independence to the ancient institution that had shaped his family for generations. Uncle Edward, Alexander realized, would have been proud of this synthesis. His uncle had always believed that the best royal service came from people who understood both duty and freedom, who chose to serve not because they had to but because they could make a genuine difference in the world. The plane touched down in London on a crisp autumn morning, and Alexander looked out the window at the country that would once again be part of his home. But this time he was arriving as someone who knew he always had the choice to leave, someone who had built a life based on his own values and decisions, someone who could contribute to his family's work while maintaining his own identity. The exile's return was complete, but it was also just the beginning of a new kind of royal service, one that honored both tradition and transformation, both family loyalty and personal authenticity. Whether it would succeed remained to be seen, but for the first time in his adult life, Alexander felt genuinely optimistic about the possibility of having both duty and happiness, both service and freedom. As he walked through the airport toward the car that would take him to his new life, Alexander carried with him the wisdom of 3 years of independence, the love of a family willing to change, and the memory of an uncle who had always believed that the best way to honor the past was to create a better future.